It was supposed to be a proud milestone, not a moment of shame. 14-year-old Jasmine Porter stepped into Oakdale Bank wearing her school uniform, a neat navy blazer and polished loafers. She carried a scholarship check worth $5,000, earned through grit, not privilege. It was her first time handling a financial transaction alone. Her hands trembled with nervous anticipation, but her eyes held steady confidence. What came next would crush that confidence in plain view of dozens of strangers. The teller inspected her check like a counterfeit bill. His eyes narrowed. Behind him, bank manager Victoria Hayes, tall, sharply dressed and cold, glanced over and frowned. "For a student your age? Where did this come from?" she asked, her voice rising just enough to gather attention. Jasmine quietly presented her ID and award letter, but it wasn't enough. "You'll wait while we verify this," Victoria snapped. Then louder, "Security, keep an eye on her. Don't let her leave." Jasmine froze as whispers filled the room. She had done nothing wrong, yet she was treated like a criminal, simply for trying to deposit a check she had earned. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Jasmine stood frozen near the corner of the gleaming marble lobby, her fingers twitching at her sides. The polished floor beneath her school shoes felt colder now, like it was siphoning the strength from her legs. Around her, the rhythm of the bank continued uninterrupted. Keyboard clicks, hushed customer service chatter, the occasional ring of a desk phone. But to Jasmine, it all sounded like white noise drowning out her heartbeat. She had imagined this day differently. In her mind that morning, she had seen herself walking into Oakdale Bank like any other client, calmly handing over her documents, making the deposit, and walking out just as confidently. She'd even planned on stopping by the corner bookstore before heading home. It was supposed to be a quiet celebration of independence. Her first solo deposit, her first taste of adulthood. But now she wasn't a client, she was a suspect. Jasmine's gaze darted across the room, scanning the curious stares of strangers who whispered in pairs or side-eyed her with assumptions etched into their expressions. A woman in pearls looked over her glasses with visible skepticism. An older man in a tailored suit leaned in to whisper something to his wife. Their murmurs didn't reach Jasmine's ears, but the look of judgment did. It hit harder than words. She tightened her grip on the folder containing her award documents, willing her arms not to shake. Victoria Hayes, the manager who had coldly declared her checks suspicious, paced in measured strides across the lobby floor. Her heels echoed with confidence Jasmine didn't feel. She didn't once glance back at Jasmine, but her earlier instructions had already taken root. A security guard stood near the entrance, arms crossed, casting periodic glances her way. Not threatening, but watching, like she might bolt at any moment. Jasmine wasn't sure if she wanted to cry or scream. She did neither. Instead, she remembered something her father had once told her. "They'll judge you without knowing your name. What you do next is who you really are." So she remained still. On the outside, she looked composed, chin high, posture straight. She was a girl who had earned a $5,000 scholarship and was proud of it. But on the inside, she felt her confidence cracking like glass under weight. She had always believed that if you worked hard, played by the rules, and stayed respectful, you'd be treated fairly. Today was shattering that belief. From her vantage point in the corner, Jasmine watched how other customers were treated. An elderly white couple entered through the tall glass doors and were immediately greeted by Victoria herself, who smiled warmly and ushered them past the line into a VIP lounge. Moments later, a young man with a thick accent and stacks of paperwork approached the counter, only to be waved off by Victoria with a fake apology about system delays. Then a white couple with similar documents to the young man entered, and Victoria practically beamed at them. "Right this way," she said with practiced charm, guiding them to the same teller who had scrutinized Jasmine's check as if it were laced with lies. Jasmine's stomach twisted. This wasn't about protocol. This wasn't about fraud prevention. This was about something deeper, something uglier, something she'd only read about in textbooks and heard in documentaries. Now she was living it. She was being profiled. Not overtly, not with slurs or threats, but with protocol weaponized against her. She glanced at the security guard again. His gaze was no longer casual. He had received new instructions. She had heard them herself. Keep an eye on her. Make sure she doesn't try to leave. As if she was a thief. As if she was dangerous. Jasmine's breath hitched. Her phone. She had left it in her locker that morning, thinking she wouldn't need it for a simple errand. She wanted desperately to call her mom, to hear the calm voice that always brought her back from the edge. But she had no lifeline. She was 14, alone, and surrounded by people who saw her as a problem instead of a person. The worst part wasn't even the public scrutiny. It was the invisibility that came with it. No one had asked if she was okay. No one had challenged Victoria. No one had stepped in. They all watched as if it were normal, as if her humiliation was just part of the scenery. A lump formed in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She thought of her mother, Dr. Naomi Porter, who had always told her that silence can be powerful if wielded with purpose. Jasmine had watched her mother stand in front of CEOs, auditors, and skeptics, never once raising her voice, yet commanding the room. Now Jasmine would do the same. She wouldn't run, she wouldn't cry, she wouldn't scream, she would endure. And she would remember every glance, every word, every insult dressed as policy. Because this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. The ticking of the wall clock became a steady metronome to Jasmine's stillness. Each second reminded her that she was being judged, not for her intelligence, not for her accomplishments, but for the color of her skin. Her heart pounded, but her hands were steady now. The silence had transformed. It wasn't submission anymore. It was strategy. Jasmine Porter wasn't just any girl. She was the daughter of Dr. Naomi Porter, a name that meant something in the world of finance, mergers, and institutional reform. But few knew that Naomi had built her empire brick by brick, often while being told she didn't belong in the room she eventually came to lead. Jasmine had grown up inside a quiet revolution. She didn't live in a castle or a penthouse. Her family home in Oak Ridge was elegant but warm, filled with books instead of brand names, with values rooted in discipline and compassion. Her mother had come from nothing, a childhood of food stamps and eviction notices, and had fought her way through school while raising Jasmine on her own. That's where Jasmine's true power came from. Not wealth, but legacy. Every Sunday morning, her mother would read the Wall Street Journal while Jasmine sat across from her doing math drills. Naomi didn't just teach her daughter numbers, she taught her meaning. What you earn means nothing if it doesn't change the world, she would say. Jasmine internalized that. She studied harder than anyone else in her class, not because she was told to, but because she wanted to prove, first to herself, then to the world, that she could carry the weight of her mother's name without asking for shortcuts. Her scholarship to Webster Academy hadn't come from connections. It came from late nights and missed parties, from solving equations until her eyes blurred, and writing essays that dissected the social structure of economic privilege. Jasmine never bragged. She didn't have to. Her achievements spoke for her. That $5,000 check in her folder, it wasn't just money. It was evidence. Evidence that a black girl from a working mother had outperformed students with 10 times her resources. That she didn't just deserve to be in that bank. She had earned her place there more than most. But Victoria Hayes couldn't see that. To Victoria, Jasmine was a threat masked as a child. Her professionalism was a mask, and Jasmine had seen behind it. She watched the manager's body language, the way she angled her torso toward white customers, the way her eyes darted around Jasmine like she was a stain on the marble. Jasmine didn't shout. She didn't demand recognition. She simply watched, and she took mental notes. Her mother would want every detail, she thought. Every time stamp, every witness, every inconsistency. She'd learned early from Naomi. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it records, quietly, patiently, then it strikes with truth. From across the room, Jasmine spotted Tom, the young teller who had first taken her check. He hadn't looked at her again since handing it off to Victoria. His expression had shifted to something she couldn't quite place. Guilt, regret, fear. Whatever it was, he wasn't brave enough to fix his mistake. That's fine, Jasmine thought. I don't need his courage. I have my own. Her eyes scanned the rest of the bank. She noticed a young woman behind the service desk, fiddling with paperwork, stealing glances toward Jasmine. Their eyes met for a brief second. The woman looked away quickly, but Jasmine saw the flicker of discomfort, maybe even empathy. It wasn't much, but it was enough to plant a seed. She reached slowly into her satchel and pulled out the leather-bound notebook she always carried, a gift from her mother on her 12th birthday. "You won't always be heard," Naomi had said, pressing the notebook into her daughter's hands. "So write. Write until they can't ignore you." Jasmine opened to a blank page and began documenting. Time of arrival, time of first interaction, name of manager, exact phrasing of Victoria's remarks, timestamps of customers arriving after her and being served ahead of her, behavioral discrepancies, names, faces, tone. She wrote in a steady, measured hand, not because she was a child in distress, but because she was building a case. And behind every word, her spine straightened. She was no longer afraid. She was prepared. Outside, the sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows on the bank's polished interior. But Jasmine remained in that same corner, quietly capturing everything. Because this wasn't just about a check anymore. It was about truth. It was about dignity. It was about a system that had assumed she wouldn't notice, wouldn't question, wouldn't fight. They were wrong. And they were about to find out just how wrong. The longer Jasmine stood in that corner, the more she began to see the full architecture of injustice. It was never just about Victoria Hayes. It was about the system that had taught Victoria she could get away with this. A system that cloaked discrimination in policy, dressed it in professional language, and made it nearly impossible to confront without being labeled difficult, angry, or unruly. Jasmine had read about systemic bias in her civics class, discussed it in debate club, and even written an award-winning paper on institutional gatekeeping in American finance. But nothing had prepared her for what it felt like to live inside it. To be the one publicly humiliated, quietly policed, and rendered invisible all at once. This wasn't about a bad employee. It was about a perfectly functioning machine, one designed to protect power and exclude threat. And Jasmine was the threat. She was young, black, brilliant, and unaccompanied. The bank's design didn't need overt racism to keep her in check. It only needed a few well-placed assumptions. Assumption 1. A black girl holding a $5,000 check must be mistaken, or worse, lying. Assumption 2. If she doesn't protest loudly, she's harmless. If she does, she's aggressive. Assumption 3. No one will stand up for her because no one wants to be labeled as a problem either. Victoria didn't invent these assumptions. She inherited them, perfected them, practiced them until they were second nature. Her condescension wasn't a personality trait. It was a learned behavior that had likely been rewarded again and again. Jasmine began to piece together the routine. When a white client entered, especially one in pearls or tailored suits, Victoria's posture changed. Her voice lifted half an octave. She offered them private rooms, smiled wider, walked them past the line like royalty. When someone like Jasmine entered, the rules shifted, the tone dropped, the skepticism emerged. Jasmine recalled how Victoria hadn't even addressed her directly after she'd asked to call her mother. "That's not our problem," she had snapped. Those 4 words now echoed like a thesis. It wasn't just Victoria. It was the entire system that had built a culture where treating someone like Jasmine with suspicion was routine, acceptable, even expected. Jasmine had seen it before. The tilted head when she entered upscale stores, the slow followed by security at luxury shops, the double checks on her school ID at library counters, the teachers who were surprised when she aced exams. It all connected. But here in the middle of Oakdee Bank, it was playing out in a more dangerous form, one that could ruin futures with the stroke of a manager's pen. She remembered what her mother once said about financial gatekeeping. The most dangerous kind of discrimination is the kind that wears a name badge and holds the keys to your money. Victoria held those keys, and she used them with absolute discretion. Jasmine's eyes shifted toward the teller line again. She noticed how some customers received smiles and small talk, while others got terse instructions. She noticed how identification was requested unevenly, how paperwork requirements seemed to shift based on the skin tone of the client, how the security guard, now stationed near her corner, had not once moved from his post since Victoria instructed him to watch her. It wasn't paranoia, it was pattern. She looked back down at her notebook and began adding new observations. She listed the differences in how white versus non-white customers were treated. She timed service durations. She noted every time someone who arrived after her was helped before her. She wasn't imagining it. The data was real. But most chilling of all was what she overheard next. Victoria, in a hushed but pointed voice, leaned toward Tom, the teller who had processed Jasmine's check. "We need to maintain our standards here," she said with a venomous sweetness. "We can't just let anyone walk in and expect to be treated like they belong." Jasmine heard every syllable. It wasn't vague anymore. It wasn't unconscious. It was deliberate. Victoria had no idea that Jasmine wasn't just a schoolgirl, that she had grown up in a household where corporate policy and institutional behavior were discussed at dinner, that she had attended equity conferences with her mother, that she had been taught not just to endure injustice, but to expose it. That was Victoria's greatest mistake. She underestimated the girl in the corner. Jasmine's hands clenched into tight fists, but she refused to raise her voice. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. She would fight this their way, by playing the long game, by gathering proof, by forcing their own system to answer for itself. Because this wasn't just personal, it was structural, and Jasmine had just begun to uncover how deep the rot ran. While Jasmine stood in dignified silence, there was another pair of eyes watching the same scene, and this time, they didn't look away. Melody Pham, a junior teller stationed near the front desk, had been listening, recording mentally, and feeling her chest tighten with every passing moment. At 24, Melody was new to banking. She'd only recently graduated from community college and joined Oak D with hopes of building a steady career. She hadn't expected to be thrown into a moral crisis so early in her tenure. At first, she told herself what many do in such moments, that perhaps it was protocol. Maybe Jasmine's check did look suspicious. Maybe Victoria was simply following guidelines. But as the minutes wore on, Melody began to recognize the pattern, and it made her stomach turn. She had served plenty of clients in her few weeks at the branch. Never once had she seen Victoria ask a security guard to stand watch over a teenage girl. Never once had she seen that kind of tone used with white customers. And never, not once, had she seen Victoria smile at someone like Jasmine the way she smiled at certain families who walked in, handed over stacks of paperwork, and were greeted with coffee and compliments. It wasn't about verification, it was about exclusion. Melody bit her lower lip as she pretended to organize papers on her desk. From the edge of her vision, she saw Jasmine jotting notes in a leather-bound notebook. The girl's posture was stiff, but there was something powerful in the way she stood. Like a storm was building inside her, but she had decided to direct it, not explode. Melody was in awe, but she also felt ashamed, because she hadn't done anything. Not yet. Across the lobby, Tom shifted nervously behind the counter. He avoided eye contact with everyone. Victoria, who had retreated to her desk, was now reviewing files with an icy calmness that only reinforced her authority. Melody realized something chilling. Victoria didn't believe she'd done anything wrong. To her, Jasmine was an interruption, a problem, a misstep to be handled, not a person to be served. And the worst part, no one was stopping her. Melody's thoughts flashed to her own younger sister, just 12, full of fire and dreams. What if that were her? What if Mia had walked into a bank like this, full of pride, only to be humiliated for daring to be confident in her own skin? Melody's hand stopped moving. That was the moment something broke. Not in fear, but in purpose. She opened her drawer, retrieved a notebook, and began her own record. 10:03 a.m., Jasmine Porter enters the bank. 10:05 a.m., presents check to Tom. 10:07 a.m., manager intervenes, tone shifts. 10:12 a.m., security instructed to monitor Jasmine. 10:35 a.m., multiple customers, white, served before Jasmine despite later arrival. Melody included observations on Victoria's body language, tone of voice, and her very public remark about standards. She even noted the different treatment of the couple with similar paperwork who were welcomed without delay. Then she saw something else, a conversation she wasn't supposed to witness. Victoria leaned in close to a man Melody didn't recognize. He was tall, professionally dressed, and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to power. They exchanged a confidential folder. Melody squinted. The label was faint, but she caught one word: Meridian. She froze. Meridian Bank was Oakday's biggest competitor, and just last month, the CEO, Dr. Naomi Porter, had acquired a boutique investment firm that was threatening Meridian's dominance. Melody's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a discriminatory incident anymore. This was bigger. This was betrayal. And Jasmine Porter, that name now clicked, Dr. Naomi Porter's daughter. No wonder the girl had stood her ground. No wonder she looked like she had been trained for this. She wasn't just standing there to defend herself. She was watching a system crack in real time and writing it down. Melody suddenly understood. This wasn't a personal crisis. It was a moment of truth, and she had a role to play. She quietly sent a secure internal message to the ethics review contact listed in the employee portal. It read, "Urgent concern, managerial misconduct, possible breach of protocol and customer profiling. Documenting evidence." Then, without fanfare, she turned on the timestamp log, pulled security footage linked to Jasmine's wait time, and printed a copy of her report to keep in her locker, just in case. For the first time that morning, Melody felt her fear give way to something stronger: conviction. She couldn't stop what had already happened to Jasmine, but she could make sure it wouldn't be ignored. She looked across the lobby once more. Jasmine stood exactly where she had been ordered, still jotting down notes. But now she wasn't alone. The machine had assumed everyone would stay quiet. It had assumed wrong. What would you do if you were in Melody's position? Would you risk your career to expose injustice? Or would you stay silent to protect yourself, knowing the cost? The wheels of the system had been turning smoothly, until now. Melody's report, though quietly filed, was not ignored. The digital flag she submitted was automatically escalated to the Office of Ethics and Compliance at Oakday's regional headquarters. There, in a small office on the 26th floor, Ava Klein, a seasoned compliance officer with a sharp eye for patterns and zero tolerance for misconduct, received the notice on her screen. The subject line read, "Urgent, managerial misconduct, Branch 17, allegation of profiling and protocol violation." Ava clicked open the file. Her eyes narrowed as she read Melody's time-stamped observations, each note growing more damning. Selective service delays, explicit surveillance orders targeting a minor, the exchange of confidential documents with a man not listed in the day's guest log, and most disturbingly, a pattern of behavior that suggested not just bias, but collusion. By noon, Ava was on a secure call with Oakday's internal audit team. She gave direct orders: pull all security footage from that morning, cross-check visitor logs, and confirm whether the name Harrison Wells, CEO of Meridian Banking Group, had been recorded. Spoiler, it hadn't. Back at Branch 17, the air had shifted. Victoria Hayes, oblivious to the investigation now unfolding above her, remained at her desk, confident in the power of procedure. Her authority, she believed, was still intact. After all, she had neutralized the threat. The girl had been contained, isolated, and kept under watch. No one had spoken up. No one had challenged her. Just another day, just another judgment call. But the machine had begun to rattle. Melody wasn't alone anymore. After submitting her internal report, she discreetly approached two other tellers she trusted, Alex and Priya, both of whom had been working under Victoria for nearly a year. They had stories too, quiet ones, the kind you only share when you think someone might actually do something with them. "I saw her turn away a man last week because she said his address didn't match the neighborhood," Priya said. "She told me to hold a black couple's deposit for extra verification because their account looked like a scam," Alex admitted, his face flushed with guilt. Melody asked one question: "Would you help me if I went further?" They didn't hesitate. "Yes." Across the lobby, Jasmine remained in the corner, still writing, still watching. Her legs were aching now, and the folder she carried was smudged from her grip. But her resolve hadn't wavered. The notebook in her hand had filled with more than just her story. It now contained the architecture of an institution slowly unmasking itself. What she didn't yet know was that her quiet resistance had begun to echo. Outside the building, a black SUV slowed to a stop. Inside it sat Dr. Naomi Porter, fresh from a boardroom consultation and still in her dark gray business suit. Her phone buzzed. A message from her assistant read, "Jasmine hasn't returned. Oak D Bank says she's still there." Naomi's eyes narrowed. She stepped out of the vehicle. Back inside, Melody's heart pounded as she noticed the sudden arrival. Through the glass doors, Naomi strode across the lobby like someone who knew every corner of the building before even entering it. Jasmine looked up. Their eyes met. Relief washed over her face, but she held it in, just like she'd been taught. Victoria, seeing Naomi approach, stood up abruptly. "Miss Porter," she said, forced pleasantries barely concealing her tension. "We weren't expecting you." Naomi raised a hand, cutting her off. She turned to Jasmine, eyes scanning her daughter's face, posture, and location. The isolated corner, the distance from any service desk, the security guard still lingering nearby. "Are you okay?" Naomi asked, her voice low but firm. "I'm fine," Jasmine replied, steady, "but you need to hear what happened." She handed her mother the notebook. Page by page, Naomi read. The color in her face changed, not to outrage, but to something far more dangerous in someone like her. Focus. Calculated, cold, tactical focus. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She turned to Victoria and said, "I believe you owe my daughter an apology, and I believe you owe me an explanation." Victoria sputtered, but Naomi's next sentence turned the tide. "You've handed confidential documents to Harrison Wells. That's not just misconduct, it's espionage." The entire bank froze. In that moment, the confrontation had begun. But what few realized was that the storm had already been gathering. In the next 30 minutes, Ava Klein entered the building with 2 auditors. Surveillance footage was seized, a formal HR review was initiated, and the CEO of Oak D was alerted. The system that once looked unshakable was now under siege, not from rage, but from truth, documentation, and a mother who refused to be silent. And the girl in the corner? She had become the eye of the storm. Silence wrapped around the bank like a wire pulled taut, waiting to snap. No one moved. No one breathed. It wasn't just the sight of Dr. Naomi Porter standing beside her daughter that stilled the room. It was the energy she brought with her, calm, precise, and unshakable, like a lawyer entering a courtroom where the verdict was already written, and not in favor of the defendant. Victoria Hayes tried to hold her posture. She squared her shoulders and mustered a synthetic smile. "Miss Porter, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was simply following—" "Protocol?" Naomi interjected, her voice cool as steel. "Tell me exactly which protocol empowers a manager to detain a minor without cause, or to hand over confidential documents to a CEO from a direct competitor, or to instruct a security guard to keep a scholarship recipient under surveillance." Jasmine stood silently beside her mother, notebook in hand, pages marked with timestamps, details, and names. The entire morning condensed into hard evidence. Victoria's smile faltered. Ava Klein, the compliance officer, stepped forward with 2 members of the internal audit team. She carried a manila folder in her hands, the same kind Victoria had slipped to Harrison Wells earlier that day. "We've reviewed your branch's security footage and cross-referenced it with the transaction logs," Ava began. "Everything Miss Porter has documented matches what we've independently verified, and more." Victoria turned toward her, now visibly sweating. I didn't do anything improper. I was trying to protect the bank." "Protect the bank from what?" Naomi asked sharply. "From a 14-year-old girl depositing a check with full documentation? Or from the reality that your bias, your disdain, nearly turned this into a national scandal?" Jasmine's voice entered the room then, steady, quiet, but undeniable. "You never even looked me in the eyes," she said, directing her words to Victoria. "You didn't see a student or a client. You saw a threat. That's the only reason I was forced to stand in that corner while others were welcomed and smiled at. You didn't just ignore me, you erased me." Gasps rippled through the staff. Melody stepped forward next, her heart thudding but her voice firm. "I filed the internal report," she said, "and I'm not the only one. Several of us have witnessed patterns of discrimination here. Clients profiled, transactions delayed, documents scrutinized unfairly. It wasn't just today." Ava nodded. "We now have multiple employee statements and video evidence. Miss Hayes, you will be placed on administrative leave, effective immediately pending the outcome of this investigation." Victoria's mouth opened, but no words came. She looked around the lobby as if hoping someone, anyone, might come to her defense. No one did. Even Tom, the teller who had started it all, stepped back, his face pale. Naomi didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply turned to Jasmine. "You ready?" Jasmine nodded. "Almost." She stepped forward and faced the staff, the clients, the very bank that had tried to silence her. "I'm not here for revenge," she said, her voice clear. "I'm here because I've learned that silence allows systems like this to survive. I was raised to believe that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about accountability and change." At that moment, the bank doors opened again. Local press had begun to arrive. Word had leaked, as it always does when injustice is exposed. Cameras flashed, reporters stepped in, but Naomi raised her hand. "No comment today," she said, shielding her daughter. "Let the system finish what it started." Victoria was escorted out of the building, the same way she had once instructed the guard to escort Jasmine. The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone. This time, the shame followed her footsteps. Inside the boardroom, Ava sat down with Naomi, Jasmine, and the senior HR director. Documents were signed. Complaints were formally logged. Action items were laid out. Immediate review of all pending transactions flagged by Victoria in the last 6 months. A full audit of branch behavior and protocol. Mandatory diversity, equity, and accountability training. Direct apologies to Jasmine Porter and her family. By the end of the day, Jasmine's voice had been heard in every corner of the institution, and she had never once raised it. On the way out, Melody caught Jasmine's eye. "You changed something today," Melody said, voice trembling. Jasmine smiled, soft but knowing. "So did you." Outside, the sun had shifted. The street buzzed with life, but the bank behind them had become something different now. No longer just a place of transactions, but a place where truth had walked in wearing a school blazer and refused to leave quietly. Jasmine stepped into the SUV, closed the door, and exhaled deeply. She had walked in with a check. She had walked out with a revolution. The following morning, Oakdale Bank's regional office exploded into controlled chaos. The board of directors, usually composed of measured voices discussing growth margins and investment opportunities, now faced something far more destabilizing. Scandal. Not a rumor, not a lawsuit quietly settled behind closed doors. This was public, documented, and boiling over across social media, television, and major financial news outlets. The headlines were relentless. 14-year-old black student humiliated at Oakdale Bank. Mother turns out to be banking titan. Discrimination, espionage, and a $5,000 check. Oakdale in crisis. Naomi Porter's daughter sparks corporate firestorm. And beneath the headlines, fury. Customers posted videos of the press swarming outside the Oakdale branch, 17 doors. Former clients shared eerily similar stories from different cities, being asked for extra documentation, being made to wait longer, or being quietly watched after entering the bank. Hashtags like Chasha banking while black, She earned it, and Jasmine Porter began trending nationally. Oakdale's executive team had no choice. Within 24 hours of the confrontation, Victoria Hayes was officially terminated, not just for discriminatory behavior, but for violation of confidentiality policy. The folder she had passed to Harrison Wells contained projected merger data for a portfolio Naomi's firm was exploring. Data flagged internal only. That folder should never have left her desk. The breach was classified as corporate espionage. But the fallout didn't stop there. Harrison Wells, the CEO of Meridian Banking Group, was subpoenaed for questioning. His firm issued a public statement denying wrongdoing, but insiders leaked details suggesting he and Victoria had been communicating for months. The stock price of Meridian dipped. Investors pulled back. Competitors circled. Naomi Porter, meanwhile, declined every interview request, except one. Standing in front of the same bank where her daughter had been treated like a criminal, Naomi gave a brief but powerful statement to the press. This isn't just about one girl or one branch. This is about every person who's ever been made to feel small while trying to do something they should be proud of. Opening an account, depositing a check, investing in their future. My daughter walked into this bank with dignity and documentation. She walked out with something far more powerful: the truth. OakD has a choice: evolve or fade. Her words echoed across networks and inspired an avalanche. Within a week, OakD Bank lost over 18,000 clients, many of them high-value account holders. 3 regional managers resigned, fearing internal audits would uncover broader patterns. The CEO of OakD held an emergency board meeting and issued a rare televised apology. We failed Jasmine Porter, we failed our clients, and we failed our principals. OakD pledged an overhaul. They announced the formation of an independent oversight council led by external diversity and ethics experts. Internal hiring and promotion procedures were frozen until bias audits could be completed. Every employee, from teller to board member, was scheduled for mandatory retraining on systemic discrimination, customer dignity, and ethical reporting. But even these moves felt reactive. What the public wanted, what Jasmine's story had awakened, was a new kind of accountability, not just punitive, transformative. Back at Branch 17, Melody Pham received a call from Human Resources. She expected backlash. Instead, they offered her a promotion: Client Integrity Supervisor, a newly created position to ensure compliance with ethical conduct, fair treatment, and internal reporting. Melody accepted, but only after requesting that 2 more junior tellers be added to her team, including Alex and Priya. Her first act in the role? She instituted a rotating, silent audit, where every teller would be anonymously observed once per week by a random staff member trained in equity review. Every interaction, every protocol, every detail would be scored. "I want this place to be what it pretends to be," Melody told her new team. "Let's make that real." Meanwhile, Jasmine returned to school. She was met with applause in the hallway of Wester Academy, but she didn't bask in the attention. She carried herself the same way she had that morning at the bank: calm, alert, intentional. When asked by a classmate how it felt to take down an entire bank, Jasmine smiled and replied, "I didn't take anything down. I held up a mirror. They cracked it themselves." She was invited to speak at the school assembly. She told the students the truth. The worst part wasn't being accused, it was being invisible. It was realizing that a system could look you in the face and still not see you. But I've learned that even in silence, you have power. Even in the corner, you can see everything. OakD Bank had collapsed, not physically, but reputationally. The pillars it had built its image upon, security, trust, professionalism, were now questioned by everyone. And in that collapse, Jasmine found something more lasting than revenge. She found momentum. In the weeks that followed the collapse, the true test began. Not for Jasmine, not for Naomi, but for OakD Bank. What would they do now that the curtain had been ripped away? Now that clients, employees, media, and regulators had seen the machinery behind the marble? Rebuilding wasn't optional, it was survival. And it started not with branding, but with truth. A third-party audit firm was hired to evaluate OakD's national operations. The findings, released to the public in a rare move for transparency, revealed what many already suspected. Bias wasn't isolated. Over 40% of flagged client complaints across branches had involved people of color. Customers in wealthier zip codes received faster approvals. Staff in certain regions were rewarded for cleaning up the queue, a euphemism, it turned out, for subtly deferring clients who didn't fit the profile. It was systemic. So OakD made the hardest, most necessary decision of all. They dismantled the system they had built. Every protocol tied to identity screening was suspended and rewritten. A new department, Client Equity and Trust, was created with real authority. Not just advisory power, but executive oversight. Every promotion, hiring choice, and regional policy would now be vetted through an equity lens. Naomi Porter, despite being the aggrieved party, was asked to chair the council overseeing these changes. She declined, but nominated someone better, Jasmine. It was unexpected, controversial, even criticized. A teenager advising corporate banking policy? Scoffed one business columnist. But Jasmine wasn't interested in optics. She was interested in outcomes. Her role wasn't ceremonial. She sat in real meetings, reviewed real documents, and asked real questions. She brought a fresh perspective that no one could replicate, not just because she had lived through discrimination, but because she had written it down, analyzed it, and turned it into policy. At the branch level, Melody's reforms became the new gold standard. Anonymous audits were now required nationally. Tellers were rewarded not just for speed and accuracy, but for equity and service, measured through real-time customer feedback and behavioral observation. Melody also helped launch a new training curriculum titled, Not Just Protocol, Seeing the Person in Front of You. It featured case studies, including Jasmine's story, and interactive sessions with community members who had once felt excluded by financial institutions. The goal wasn't to shame employees, it was to awaken them. Meanwhile, Jasmine quietly returned to her life, school, homework, piano practice. She didn't seek out interviews or endorsement deals, though many were offered. What she did do was start a digital journal called Belonging. It became a platform where people from all walks of life could submit their stories, moments where they had been othered, dismissed, overlooked. Within months, thousands of submissions poured in. A girl in Texas denied entry to a scholarship ceremony because staff thought she was a server. A boy in Atlanta asked to leave a car dealership while his white friend was encouraged to test drive. An immigrant mother turned away from a medical office because her accent was too difficult. Jasmine read every story, and for each one she remembered the marble floor beneath her feet, the security guard's watchful eyes, the weight of being seen as unworthy. She knew what it meant to be erased. So now she made it her mission to help people reclaim visibility. Wester Academy, her school, added an elective called Justice and Systems, built in part on Jasmine's recommendations. She didn't teach it, but she visited sometimes just to listen, just to hear how her story had rippled into new minds. Not everyone embraced the change. Some OAK branches resisted. Some customers rolled their eyes at the new signage and training videos. Some employees grumbled that things were getting too political, but the bank's leadership stood firm. Public trust was rebounding, slowly but surely, and for the first time in its history, OAK reported an increase in minority account holders who cited trust as their reason for switching banks. Victoria Hayes, the former manager, never resurfaced publicly. Her termination had been final, but Jasmine had learned not to fixate on the downfall of one person. Systems were bigger than individuals, and reform was more powerful than revenge. At home, Naomi sometimes watched her daughter from the kitchen table. How Jasmine read every submission to Belonging, how she annotated her textbooks, how she smiled with quiet satisfaction after another board meeting. She's not just changing banking, Naomi told a friend once. She's changing how institutions see people. One afternoon, months after the incident, Jasmine received a letter in the mail. The envelope was simple, the handwriting unfamiliar. Inside was a note from a former OAK customer who had closed their account the week of the scandal. It read, "Thank you for standing when others didn't. My daughter's watching, and now I have something to show her when she asks what courage looks like." Jasmine folded the letter and tucked it inside her notebook. The same one she had clutched that day, the same one that had once held pain. Now it held purpose. Long after the headlines faded and the policies were rewritten, Jasmine Porter's story continued to echo, not because of the scandal, but because of the transformation it inspired. What began as a moment of humiliation inside a marble-floored bank had grown into a quiet revolution of conscience across institutions, families, classrooms, and communities. It wasn't that the world changed overnight. It never does. But something fundamental had shifted, and Jasmine's name was now attached to that shift. Months after the incident, OAK Bank unveiled its new internal motto, "See the whole person." It replaced the old branding about excellence and security. New signage appeared across branches. Training videos no longer began with hypothetical customer interactions. They began with Jasmine's actual story, retold with her permission, word for word. The bank wasn't just trying to look better, it was trying to be better. Because Jasmine had made it clear that real justice isn't about damage control, it's about culture change. Naomi Porter, ever reserved in public, said it best in a panel on ethical leadership at a financial summit. My daughter reminded the industry that power doesn't lie in boardrooms. It walks through our doors every day. The difference is whether we choose to recognize it. Jasmine, meanwhile, never let herself become a symbol detached from reality. She continued attending school, participating in debate club, and working on her online journal, Belonging. But her life had changed. She received letters, hundreds, from students, parents, educators, and even bankers who had quietly witnessed discrimination and said nothing. Some letters were long and confessional. Others just said, "Thank you, I see it now." That to Jasmine was the legacy worth fighting for. Not the end of one manager's career, but the beginning of people seeing what they used to overlook. In the spring, she was invited to give the keynote speech at the Youth Equity Forum, a national event for teenage activists, educators, and innovators. The stage was vast. The lights were hot. She stood alone behind the podium, wearing the same navy blazer she had worn the day it all began. She didn't speak as a victim. She didn't speak with anger. She spoke with clarity. "I wasn't brave because I wanted to be," she began. "I was brave because I had no choice. I walked into a bank with a check and a dream. I left with a notebook full of evidence and a reason to speak up. But here's the thing. They expected me to be angry, to yell, to make a scene. I didn't. I wrote. I remembered. I waited. Because justice isn't about how loud you are. It's about how long you're willing to look at something wrong and not flinch. I didn't flinch, and I hope none of you will either." The room erupted, not in applause but in stillness. That kind of stillness only truth can command. After the speech, one of the forum organizers handed Jasmine a small box. Inside was a silver fountain pen engraved with the words, "Courage writes its own legacy." She carried it in her backpack from then on, next to the leather notebook she had filled during her hours in that cold bank corner. Back in Oak Ridge, the staff at Branch 17 looked different. Melody now led a diverse team with renewed purpose. The space that once radiated exclusion now hummed with quiet accountability. Mistakes still happened, as they do in every human system. But now those mistakes were seen, addressed, and learned from. That alone was a kind of justice. Priya, one of the tellers who had once been too afraid to speak up, now ran workshops for new hires. She often began with a quote Jasmine had used: "The worst injustice is the one no one sees, because then it never ends." That quote now hung on a framed plaque in the employee break room. Jasmine's notebook eventually became more than just a personal diary. With help from her teachers, she turned it into a self-published book, The Corner, a story of dignity, data, and defiance. It was part memoir, part documentation, part call to action. It was read in schools and used in corporate training sessions. She didn't publish it to become famous. She published it so that no one could say, "I didn't know." Because now they did. And perhaps the most lasting impact wasn't in banks or boardrooms, but in homes. Parents of young black girls began telling Jasmine's story, not as a tale of warning, but as a source of pride. "You can be like her," they said. "You can speak with strength, and you will be heard." One morning, as Jasmine walked past Oak D Bank on her way to school, she paused. The same glass doors, the same polished floors. But now there was a community board near the front window. Photos of local students, scholarship winners, small business owners. Jasmine's own photo wasn't there, but she didn't need it to be. Her presence lived in every new protocol, every updated manual, every employee who hesitated before making assumptions. She had changed something that day, and it stayed changed. Because moral legacies aren't built by noise. They're built by integrity, held steady in the face of insult, and made undeniable through action. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch more gripping stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.